What if Meghan Markle's royal fairy tale wasn't an accident of fate at all? What if it was, as Thomas Markle now suggests, a meticulously orchestrated plan, seeded years before she ever laid eyes on Prince Harry? Imagine, for a moment, that the romantic narrative sold to millions across the globe wasn't spontaneous love, but the result of ambition carefully nurtured, written in private emails, scrawled into diaries, and whispered to friends long before the cameras rolled. That question is what shatters the polished glass of the story we've all been told. And it's why the UK, indeed, much of the world, now sits on the edge of its seat, waiting for the truth Thomas claims he's about to expose. Thomas Markle. Father. Outsider. Betrayer. Victim. Depending on who you ask, his name conjures pity, anger, or suspicion. For Meghan, he represents one of the most complicated relationships of her life. A man whose very presence seems to unravel her carefully constructed image every time he opens his mouth. For years, Meghan has painted herself as the daughter abandoned, pushed aside, heartbroken by a father who spoke to the press instead of protecting her. And yet, here he is again, stirring the pot in ways that no tabloid or royal insider could. This time, not with petty grievances or sad photographs, but with alleged evidence, old writings, words that Thomas claims reveal Meghan's royal ambitions long before destiny ever introduced her to Harry. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, let me ask you, how do you react when the fairy tale suddenly starts to look like a script? A script where the prince was never random, but a role in the play. Would you feel deceived? Or would you admire the sheer boldness of such a plan? Think about it. In a world obsessed with reality TV, influencers, and image management, why should royalty be exempt from being another stage? Meghan Markle, an actress trained in the art of performance, may have just delivered the performance of her life. And if Thomas's claims hold weight, the script wasn't improvised, it was rehearsed. But before we dive into the allegations themselves, we have to understand the stakes. Why does this matter now? Why should the world care whether Meghan dreamed of marrying into royalty long before Harry came along? Because this isn't just about Meghan. It's about trust. It's about image. It's about whether the royal family, already bruised by scandal after scandal, can withstand yet another wave of doubt. When you peel away the carefully cultivated image of the Sussexes as victims of circumstance, as lovers who dared to defy the odds, what's left? A story of manipulation? Or a woman who outsmarted an institution that's been manipulating others for centuries? The answer could shift the way millions see her, and, by extension, the monarchy itself. And that is exactly why Buckingham Palace is nervous. They know public opinion is fragile. One day, Meghan and Harry are hailed as brave whistleblowers exposing outdated traditions. The next, they're accused of hypocrisy, using titles while trashing the system that gave them status. This revelation from Thomas, whether fact, exaggeration, or outright fabrication, strikes at the heart of that tension. If Meghan plotted her rise long before, then everything else, from the Oprah interview to the Netflix specials, starts to look different. More calculated, less romantic, more transactional. Here's the thing about ambition, it isn't inherently evil. Every person who's ever achieved anything significant has, in one way or another, dreamed it first, maybe even obsessed over it. Meghan dreaming of a royal life wouldn't be unusual. Millions of young girls do it. But here's the contradiction that makes Thomas's claims so explosive. Meghan has publicly insisted, time and time again, that she didn't know much about Harry, that she didn't Google him, that she was blindsided by the protocols and pressures of royal life. That innocence, that wide-eyed naivety, is central to her brand. Without it, the poor outsider crushed by the machine narrative collapses. And if Thomas can prove she knew exactly what she was stepping into, then Meghan's greatest weapon, public sympathy, shatters. Let's pause for a second. Can you imagine Meghan in her Toronto apartment, scrolling late at night, typing emails to friends about her fascination with British royalty? Maybe jotting down diary entries about castles, crowns, and fairy tales not as fantasies, but as goals? How does that image sit with you? Is it relatable, a girl daring to dream big? Or unsettling, a sign of someone already rehearsing a role they hadn't yet been offered? This is where the emotional contradiction comes in. If she was just dreaming, then Thomas is cruel for weaponizing it. But if she was planning, then the love story becomes something much darker. Thomas's timing is no accident. Notice how his revelations always seem to land when Meghan and Harry are either rising in popularity or in the headlines for something major. He knows how to insert himself, to remind the world that he holds pieces of Meghan's past that she'd rather bury. And the question becomes, is he seeking truth or revenge? Is he protecting the monarchy or simply settling old scores with a daughter who cut him off? This ambiguity is part of what makes the story so gripping. You can't look away because you're never sure where the line between truth and bitterness lies. Still, the emails, the diaries, the conversations. Imagine if they exist. Imagine if they're real and Thomas places them in the public eye. The shock wouldn't just ripple through the press. It would explode across every headline, every talk show, every online forum. The narrative of Meghan as naive bride blindsided by tradition would collapse overnight. And with it, Harry's reputation as the protective husband might also fall apart. Because if Meghan knew, if she planned, then what does that say about him? Was he complicit? Duped? Or just a love-struck prince unable to see the stage lights in front of him? And let's not forget the palace. The one institution that hates nothing more than losing control of the narrative. Meghan's rise was already a disruption, already a scandal in their eyes. But to learn she may have plotted her way into the family, that's not just a disruption, that's an invasion. It would fuel the argument that Meghan was never a victim of the system, but a threat to it from the very beginning. And if that's true, then every step she took, from the wedding to the exit, was part of a long game far larger than anyone suspected. Which leads us to the cliffhanger. Because Thomas Markle isn't just dropping vague hints anymore. He's promising specifics, old writings, alleged proof, things the palace and Meghan herself would rather the world never see. And if what he claims is true, then the UK isn't just facing another royal scandal. It's facing the unraveling of a story millions believed was love. A story millions wanted to believe was love. But what comes next could destroy that illusion forever. And here's the chilling part. Thomas says he hasn't even revealed the most shocking piece yet. How did a father and daughter go from sharing quiet dinners and wedding day dreams to airing their darkest secrets on global television? How does a bond once rooted in trust unravel into betrayal so sharp that even the most private words, old emails, diary entries, whispered conversations, are now weapons in a public war? That is the question that defines the fractured relationship between Meghan Markle and her father, Thomas Markle. And to understand the shocking revelations he claims to hold, we first have to step inside that divide, to trace the cracks that widened into a chasm so deep, reconciliation seems impossible. Thomas wasn't always Meghan's enemy. For much of her life, he was her support system, her silent protector. A hardworking lighting director in Hollywood, Thomas provided Meghan with access to a world far removed from the ordinary. On set, little Meghan would watch the cameras roll, see the actors rehearse, and absorb the magic of storytelling. In a way, Thomas introduced her to performance, to the idea that image could be constructed, perfected, and sold. Think about that irony. The very man who gave Meghan the tools of performance may now be accusing her of living her greatest performance of all. Doesn't that sting with Shakespearean drama? But let's go deeper. Picture Meghan as a young woman, ambitious, restless, determined to rise above her beginnings. She leaned on Thomas for financial support, for encouragement, for the connections his career could offer. He, in return, adored his daughter. Yet, beneath this seemingly stable bond, small tensions simmered. Thomas, by many accounts, was proud but also fragile, vulnerable to stress and personal struggles. Meghan, on the other hand, was laser-focused on moving forward. Ambition drove her, sentimentality slowed her down. When two personalities like that clash, the fallout is inevitable. And the fallout, as we all know, came spectacularly. The wedding was the turning point. Royal watchers remember it vividly. Meghan, radiant in white, walking halfway down the aisle alone before Prince Charles stepped in. A statement of independence, yes, but also a glaring absence. Her father wasn't there. He had been caught in a media storm, accused of staging paparazzi photos and cashing in on his daughter's new fame. From that moment, Meghan's narrative hardened. Her father was unreliable, embarrassing, a man who betrayed her trust for money. Yet Thomas insists he was misunderstood, manipulated, pushed aside by palace handlers who never wanted him there in the first place. Which version do you believe? Was Thomas the careless father who sold out his daughter, or the scapegoat conveniently silenced when his presence no longer fit the royal image? This is where it gets even more complicated. Because Thomas didn't disappear quietly. He spoke out, again and again. Interviews, letters, public pleas. And each time, the divide between him and Meghan grew deeper. What began as a family quarrel transformed into an international spectacle. Meghan's defenders saw a toxic father exploiting her fame. Thomas's defenders saw a grieving parent abandoned by a daughter who owed him loyalty. But here's the twist. Thomas wasn't just complaining. He hinted, subtly at first, that he had kept things, documents, messages, proof, that could reshape how the world viewed Meghan. Why keep them unless you intended to use them one day? Think about the psychological weight of that. A daughter, already estranged, knowing her father holds fragments of her past that could be unleashed at any moment. Doesn't that explain Meghan's determination to sever ties completely? And doesn't it also explain Thomas's insistence on speaking out, as if daring her to acknowledge him? Their relationship isn't just broken, it's weaponized. And the emotional stakes here are enormous. For Meghan, every word Thomas speaks chips away at her carefully maintained image. For Thomas, every silence from Meghan reinforces his sense of betrayal. He raised her, he sacrificed for her, and now she won't even speak to him. To him, that's unforgivable. To her, his public betrayals are unforgivable. Who's right? Who's wrong? Or is this one of those rare cases where both are simultaneously victim and villain? What makes this chapter so essential is that it frames Thomas not just as a bitter outsider, but as someone with a very personal motivation. This isn't just about Meghan marrying into royalty. It's about a father's pride, a daughter's ambition, and the bitter collision between the two. And if Thomas's accusations are to be taken seriously, then understanding the depth of this divide is crucial. Because only in that tension can we see why he would finally choose to expose the private writings and conversations he's held on to for years. Now ask yourself, how far would a parent go to prove a point? Would you expose your own child's secrets, risk destroying their reputation, just to reclaim your place in their story? That's the haunting question Thomas forces us to confront. Maybe he feels justified. Maybe he feels abandoned. Or maybe, just maybe, he knows that what he holds could topple Meghan's narrative in a way no palace official or tabloid ever could. And here's the chilling part. Thomas hasn't even shown everything yet. He claims to be sitting on more, waiting, holding back. The father-daughter divide isn't just tragic. It's dangerous. Because every time Meghan tries to silence the past, Thomas whispers that the past still has a voice. And sooner or later, that voice might roar. But what exactly does he have? What writings could twist the public's view of Meghan from victim to mastermind? What proof could make the UK question whether her rise was destiny or design? That is where we turn next. Because Thomas insists that it all begins with emails, old messages that Meghan never wanted the world to see. Imagine opening an inbox and stumbling upon words that change everything. Not gossip, not small talk, but lines that hint at dreams so big, so daring, that they blur the line between fantasy and strategy. That is the picture Thomas Markle paints when he speaks of Meghan's old emails. To him, these aren't just scraps of conversation. They are evidence. Evidence, he claims, that Meghan wasn't a naive actress blindsided by a prince's love, but a woman scripting her royal ascent years in advance. And here's the shocker. Thomas suggests these emails existed long before Harry ever entered the scene. Words written when Meghan was still grinding in Hollywood, balancing auditions with bit parts, hustling on sets where fame always seemed just out of reach. Picture her sitting at her laptop late at night, exhausted from another failed casting call, pouring her frustrations and ambitions into typed lines. What if those words reveal not just a desire for success, but a plan to achieve it through royalty? Let me ask you directly. If you discovered your daughter had been writing about marrying into power, would you see it as innocent dreaming or as evidence of ruthless calculation? This is the razor's edge we're walking here. Thomas, bitter and estranged, leans toward the second interpretation. He paints Meghan as someone who wasn't just chasing love, but chasing a crown. Now, let's put ourselves in Meghan's shoes. Emails are snapshots of our private thoughts, written in moments of vulnerability. Who hasn't typed out something ambitious, something outrageous, maybe even something we'd be embarrassed for others to read? Maybe Meghan's words were nothing more than youthful venting. Maybe she was joking, fantasizing, the way millions of people do when they say, "I wish I could be a princess." If that's the case, then Thomas's claims are cruel, dragging harmless dreams into the spotlight. But Thomas hints at more. He describes those emails as structured, intentional, almost like notes on a game plan. Not just, "Wouldn't it be nice to marry a prince?" but discussions of how one could enter elite circles, how one could gain proximity to power. That, if true, transforms the narrative. Because it's no longer a child's fantasy. It becomes a roadmap. And here's where the contradictions begin to bite. Meghan has always maintained that she knew little about Harry before meeting him. She claimed she didn't Google him, didn't study the royals, didn't understand the magnitude of the institution she was marrying into. Yet, if Thomas's interpretation of these emails is right, those statements collapse. The innocent outsider becomes a strategist who knew exactly what she was chasing. That contradiction alone is enough to ignite suspicion. Let's take this further. Think about how Meghan presented herself during her early interviews with Harry. Wide-eyed, unsure, even overwhelmed. The girl who said she had no idea what curtsying to the Queen meant. It made her relatable. It made her sympathetic. But if in those old emails she had already been writing about marrying into royalty, then that performance, and yes, it would feel like a performance, looks very different. The irony here is brutal. The actress who wanted to stop acting may have been acting all along. But the most important question remains. Do those emails still exist? Thomas insists they do. He hints he's held on to them, perhaps even protected them for this very moment. And that alone raises another chilling possibility: leverage. Was Thomas keeping those emails not just as a memory, but as a weapon? If so, why reveal them now? Why wait until Meghan is entrenched in her new life with Harry, until the palace has distanced itself from him, until the public's opinion is fractured? Could it be because Thomas knows that timing is everything? That dropping this now maximizes the damage? Think about the public's reaction. Imagine the headlines if even a single email were to surface showing Meghan writing about her dream of becoming a princess long before Harry. The outrage would be immediate. Commentators would say she plotted, schemed, climbed. Her defenders would argue she was simply manifesting a dream. And the public, fickle, emotional, hungry for scandal, would split down the middle. And what of Harry? If those emails exist, and he's seen them, then his silence speaks volumes. Is he protecting Meghan from a narrative that could destroy her carefully crafted image? Or is he himself caught in the web, forced to ignore the signs because the truth would unravel not just his wife's credibility, but his own judgment? Doesn't that possibility haunt you? A prince blinded by love, unable, or unwilling, to see the stage directions playing out before him. Yet, Thomas doesn't stop at the emails. He suggests they're only the beginning, the surface of a much deeper archive. Because while emails can be denied, dismissed as out of context, there are other writings harder to ignore. Diaries, handwritten notes, the kind of personal reflections that cut through excuses and expose the raw truth. And that, Thomas hints, is where the real bombshell lies. Because buried in those private pages, Meghan may have written her most honest thoughts, not for friends, not for emails, but for herself. And those words, if revealed, could be devastating. The emails light the spark, but the diaries? They're the explosion waiting to happen. Picture this, a diary. Its cover worn, its pages filled with scribbles and secrets never meant for anyone else's eyes. Diaries are where people confess, where they plot, where they allow their truest selves to spill out without fear of judgment. Now imagine Thomas Markle, holding what he claims are pages written by Meghan years before she met Harry. Imagine him whispering that inside those entries are not just childhood musings, but chillingly precise notes that sound less like daydreams and more like strategy. Suddenly, Meghan's diaries stop being innocent reflections and start to look like evidence. Here's the haunting question. What if Meghan's happily ever after was scripted line by line in her own handwriting? Think about what that would mean. The entire global narrative, the fairy tale wedding, the whirlwind romance, the sympathetic victimhood of a young woman blindsided by royal tradition, all of it could crumble. Because if Meghan had written about marrying into royalty long before Harry, then her image as the unsuspecting bride is gone, replaced instead by the image of an ambitious strategist who knew exactly what she wanted. Let's pause and ask, have you ever written something in a diary that you wouldn't want the world to see? Of course you have. Everyone has. But here's the twist. Most of us aren't marrying into the most scrutinized family on earth. Most of us don't have diaries that, if exposed, could flip international opinion. Meghan's alleged entries carry that kind of weight, and Thomas, estranged and embittered, seems ready to use them. Now, we have to consider the context. Meghan was an actress. Her career, while moderately successful, wasn't what she dreamed it would be. She was frustrated with small roles, with being pigeonholed, with the limitations of Hollywood's hierarchy. Diaries, Thomas suggests, captured her venting. But what if those vents contained lines like, "I want influence," or "a life bigger than Hollywood"? What if she wrote about Britain, about royalty, about finding a prince? Innocent or not, those words, if they exist, would strike like thunderbolts today. And here's the contradiction that makes this so explosive. Meghan has consistently claimed she didn't understand the royal world before Harry. She said she didn't Google him, didn't know what curtsying was, didn't grasp the intensity of the monarchy. Those claims made her sympathetic, the innocent outsider. But diary entries that show she was fascinated by the royals years earlier? That changes everything. Suddenly, innocence looks like deceit. Consider the psychological impact of this too. Diaries are supposed to be private. If Meghan truly wrote these thoughts, she never expected them to surface. Which raises another unsettling question. How did Thomas get them? Did Meghan leave them behind when she cut ties? Did Thomas keep old belongings from her youth, perhaps stored away in boxes he never returned? Or is this claim exaggerated, a way for him to terrify Meghan without producing actual proof? Either way, the idea of a father holding on to his daughter's most intimate writings, waiting to expose them, is chilling, and it explains the venom in Meghan's decision to sever all contact. Imagine the fallout if these diaries were read aloud in public. A courtroom setting, a tabloid leak, a TV interview. Meghan's own words, her handwriting, contradicting years of polished interviews and carefully curated branding. It would be devastating. Her critics would feast on it. Her supporters would scramble to explain it. And Harry? He would be humiliated. Because how do you defend a wife who swore she didn't know, when her own diaries say otherwise? But let's step back for a moment. Could these diaries also show vulnerability, not just strategy? Could they reveal Meghan as a young woman dreaming big, no different from millions of others who fantasize about escaping ordinary life? If so, then Thomas's use of them becomes cruel, manipulative, a father exploiting his daughter's teenage or young adult musings to damage her. That's the irony here. The same evidence could be seen as harmless dreaming or as damning proof. The interpretation depends on the eye of the beholder. And yet Thomas insists there's more. Not just vague entries, but specific passages, phrases that hint at a deliberate vision of a royal life. That specificity is what makes his claims so dangerous. Because once specifics are introduced, denial becomes harder. The world doesn't forget phrases like, "marry a prince." Those words stick, even if they were never meant to be taken literally. Let's not forget the palace in all of this. If they knew Meghan had written about royalty years earlier, how would they react? Would they see her as a threat who infiltrated the family? Or would they see her as another ambitious outsider trying to fit in? Their silence so far is telling. Because silence, in cases like this, often hides fear. And here's where the suspense builds to its sharpest point. Thomas doesn't just talk about diaries in passing. He hints that inside them lies a mention of a prince. Not necessarily Harry by name, but a prince, a royal. That single detail alone could ignite a firestorm. Because if Meghan wrote about a prince before Harry, the implication is unavoidable. She was targeting the role, not the man. That one revelation would change everything. But diaries aren't the only place Meghan allegedly voiced these dreams. Because while written words are dangerous, spoken ones can be even more damning. And Thomas claims that friends, old acquaintances, even former boyfriends remember the conversations Meghan had about her royal ambitions. And those whispers, those conversations, may be the very thing that proves her diary entries weren't just fantasies, but part of a larger plan. Imagine being in a cafe with Meghan Markle years before she ever met Prince Harry. She's animated, charismatic, laughing as she talks about her dreams. She mentions acting, yes, the grind of auditions, the frustration of bit roles. But then, her voice shifts. She talks about influence, about status, about a life larger than Hollywood could offer. And then comes the line that makes her friends freeze. I could totally see myself as a princess. At the time, maybe it was playful. Maybe it was a joke. But in hindsight, those conversations don't sound like casual banter anymore. They sound like prophecy. Or worse, strategy. That's what Thomas Markle wants the world to believe. That Meghan, long before Harry, was telling people she had her sights set on royalty. Not just stardom, not just wealth, royalty. And now, those whispers from her past are being dragged into the light. Let's break this down. Friends and acquaintances of Meghan have, over the years, hinted at her fascination with power. Some recall her speaking about the British royals as if they were characters in a drama she wanted to join. Others remember her bringing up the idea of marrying a British aristocrat or finding her prince. Alone, each memory could be dismissed as exaggeration. But together, they form a pattern, one that aligns disturbingly well with Thomas's claims. And here's where the tension spikes. Because Meghan, in every interview since marrying Harry, has painted herself as the woman who didn't know what she was stepping into. The one who had to Google the national anthem after joining the firm. The one blindsided by palace rules and royal protocols. She sells innocence, naivety. But if her friends' recollections are true, then that innocence is shattered. Doesn't that contradiction cut deep? Now, imagine being one of those friends. Years later, you're watching Meghan walk down the aisle in Windsor, the world hailing her as a fairy tale bride. And you're thinking back to those conversations, to the times she half joked, half confessed that she wanted to marry a prince. Would you feel proud of her for manifesting her dream? Or uneasy, realizing she had accomplished exactly what she once described? This is where Meghan's story becomes almost cinematic. It's not just romance. It's ambition realized. Let's not forget Meghan's ex-boyfriends. Some have hinted, subtly, that she was always drawn to influence. Corey Vitiello, the Toronto chef she dated before Harry, was well-connected socially. Trevor Engelson, her first husband, worked in Hollywood. Meghan didn't date small. She dated up. And in those relationships, some claim, she occasionally spoke about wanting something bigger. Not just love, legacy. Doesn't that make you wonder if Harry was simply the final, perfect step in a long series of upward moves? And then, there's the curious timing. Meghan's social circles in Toronto overlapped with British elites through friends like Jessica Mulroney. Suddenly, she wasn't just an actress on Suits. She was mingling with people who brushed shoulders with royals. Did she sense opportunity? Did she talk about it with her friends, testing the waters, dropping hints about her willingness to step into that world? Thomas believes so. And if he's right, then Meghan's royal romance wasn't lightning striking out of nowhere. It was the result of years of networking, positioning, and, yes, conversations that laid the groundwork. But here's the kicker. Words spoken casually at brunch or at a party can seem harmless in the moment. They can even be forgotten. But when they're remembered years later, after the speaker becomes a duchess, they gain an entirely new weight. A friend remembering Meghan saying, "I want to be a princess," might once have laughed. Now, they say it with wide eyes, realizing she wasn't joking after all. And this is where the emotional beat deepens. Was Meghan simply dreaming out loud, like countless other women who say they want to marry rich, marry powerful, marry famous? Or was she declaring intent? That distinction matters. Because if it's the latter, then Meghan's story with Harry isn't romance. It's conquest. Let's ask directly. Do you believe people can speak their destiny into existence? Or do you believe that when someone talks too much about their goals, it means they're actively chasing them? Meghan's conversations with friends blur that line. And depending on which side you fall on, you'll either see her as a visionary or as a manipulator. And yet, Thomas doesn't stop at the whispers of friends. He claims these conversations weren't isolated, that Meghan repeated them often enough, to enough people, that it's clear they weren't jokes. They were hints of a plan. That's why he insists on exposing them now. Because to him, these conversations prove that Meghan always knew what she was doing. But here's where the suspense climbs even higher. Because conversations can be denied. Friends' memories can be dismissed as unreliable. But what about actions? What about the way Meghan positioned herself socially, the choices she made, the circles she entered? Thomas insists that Meghan didn't just talk. She acted. She moved. She calculated. And those actions, he claims, show exactly how she targeted the spotlight long before Harry came into view. She lived it. That's what Thomas Markle wants the world to see. Meghan Markle wasn't merely scribbling ideas in a diary or joking over brunch with friends about finding a prince. She was moving pieces on a chessboard, positioning herself, climbing deliberately, building a network that would take her from a television actress to one of the most famous women on earth. And if you look closely at her path, you start to see what Thomas calls the unmistakable fingerprints of strategy. Let's begin in Hollywood. Meghan had tasted the industry's coldness. She landed a few roles here and there, but not the stardom she craved. For years, she was the girl at the party or the paralegal in Suits, respected but never iconic. This is important because it sets the stage for her hunger, for her need to leap into a world where ceilings didn't exist. Hollywood was crowded, but royalty? Royalty was rare. The scarcity made it alluring, and Thomas claims Meghan knew it. Think about Toronto, Meghan's world during her Suits years. The city wasn't just home to filming. It was a hub of socialites, politicians, and powerful families. Meghan inserted herself there with precision. Through friendships like the one she built with Jessica Mulroney, she gained access to elite circles. Charity galas, exclusive dinners, high-profile events. Meghan wasn't just showing up. She was making herself visible, noticed, talked about. Doesn't that sound less like coincidence and more like strategy? Ask yourself, have you ever met someone who always seemed to just happen to be at the right place at the right time? Meghan was that person. But here's the thing, being in the right place at the right time isn't always luck. Sometimes it's design. Meghan appeared at events where British aristocrats circulated. She charmed people connected to the royals. She surrounded herself with individuals who could open doors. And according to Thomas, that wasn't random. That was the plan. Now let's talk about image. Meghan wasn't a household name when she starred in Suits, but she curated herself like one. A lifestyle blog, The Tig, carefully crafted Instagram posts, fashion choices that screamed sophistication over flash. She wasn't selling herself as just another actress. She was selling herself as global, refined, aspirational. In Thomas's eyes, this was branding, a public audition for a bigger role than Hollywood could ever offer. And then there's the irony. Meghan, who has often painted herself as an outsider in the royal system, was in fact, if Thomas is to be believed, actively pushing herself toward it. Picture it. A woman who knows the royal family represents the ultimate stage, carefully maneuvering closer and closer until, finally, she's center spotlight. Doesn't that flip the entire narrative upside down? But here's where the emotion kicks in. Thomas Markle doesn't just describe Meghan's networking as ambition. He describes it as coldness. He paints a picture of his daughter strategically shedding people who no longer served her climb. Old friends left behind. Family members ignored. Romantic partners replaced. Was that just natural growth, or was it ruthless pruning? Ask yourself, how many of us sacrifice relationships to pursue ambition? And at what point does ambition become manipulation? And remember, Meghan has always denied being strategic. She's told the world she fell into love with Harry by chance, that she had no knowledge of the monarchy. Yet every move Thomas points to, the galas, the networking, the lifestyle branding, screams calculation. The contradiction is striking, and contradictions are what erode trust. Let's not forget how this looked from the outside, either. Friends from her Toronto circle whispered even then about Meghan, always aiming higher. Some admired her. Others rolled their eyes. But Thomas insists that even they didn't see the full scope. To him, Meghan wasn't just aiming higher. She was aiming royal. And here comes the twist. Because just as Meghan was moving in these circles, just as she was curating her brand, she crossed paths with the Mulroneys, a family with direct ties to the royal world. Through Jessica Mulroney, Meghan stepped even closer to the glittering doors of British aristocracy. Coincidence? Thomas doesn't think so. He believes Meghan positioned herself exactly where opportunity would strike. But here's the cliffhanger. Networking and branding only take you so far. At some point, ambition needs a connection, a bridge from aspiration to reality. And Meghan, Thomas claims, found hers in Jessica Mulroney. Because Jessica wasn't just a friend. She was a gatekeeper, a link between Meghan's dreams and the royal circles she so desperately wanted to enter. And that friendship, Thomas insists, wasn't just social. It was strategic. It always begins with a connection. The right friend, the right introduction, the right door opening at just the right time. For Meghan Markle, that connection was Jessica Mulroney, a woman whose ties stretched far beyond the glamorous social circles of Toronto into the corridors of British high society. And if you believe Thomas Markle's version of events, Meghan didn't just stumble into that friendship. She recognized its power. She cultivated it. And she used it as a stepping stone toward the ultimate prize. Who is Jessica Mulroney? On the surface, she's a Canadian stylist, television personality, and socialite. But beneath the glossy Instagram feeds and curated appearances lies something much more valuable: connections. Jessica is married to Ben Mulroney, son of former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, whose family is tightly woven into political and aristocratic fabrics. The Mulroneys were not just famous, they were influential. And their influence stretched across the Atlantic, brushing against British aristocracy and even the royal family. To an ambitious Meghan Markle, that made Jessica less of a friend and more of a golden ticket. Now picture this: Meghan, an actress on Suits, mingling at Toronto galas, rubbing shoulders with society's elite. Among them, Jessica Mulroney, stylish, well-connected, and positioned exactly where Meghan wanted to be. Their friendship blossomed quickly, almost suspiciously quickly. Dinners, shopping trips, joint appearances. Soon, Meghan wasn't just on Suits. She was Jessica Mulroney's best friend. Doesn't that sound like a calculated upgrade? And here's where Thomas Markle's accusations cut deep. He claims Meghan knew exactly what she was doing, that she wasn't building friendships for warmth or loyalty, but for access. Think about it. Jessica was friends with Sophie Trudeau, wife of the Canadian Prime Minister. She had ties to British elites. She existed in the exact kind of circle Meghan needed to enter if she ever wanted her royal dream to materialize. So was Meghan simply being social, or was she climbing? Ask yourself this. Have you ever met someone who always seems to align themselves with the right people? People whose value isn't just personal, but strategic? That's how Thomas paints Meghan's approach to Jessica. Not accidental, not organic, strategic. And when Meghan later became a duchess, Jessica's role as her royal stylist wasn't just convenient. It was confirmation that their friendship had delivered exactly the access Meghan wanted. Let's talk symbolism here. Meghan reportedly leaned on Jessica for more than just clothes. She leaned on her for introductions, for credibility in socialite spaces, for a level of legitimacy among the powerful that her Hollywood resume alone couldn't provide. Jessica opened doors, and Meghan walked through every single one. Doesn't that sound less like coincidence and more like chess? Now, imagine how the palace would have viewed this. A woman from outside, strategically climbing through social connections, suddenly appearing in the orbit of their prince. To royal traditionalists, this wasn't romance. It was infiltration, a threat. And if Thomas's claims are true, Meghan was already rehearsing the role long before the cameras caught her smiling beside Harry. And yet, here's where the emotional contradiction comes in. To Meghan's supporters, this wasn't calculation, it was resilience. A woman from a modest background using the tools at her disposal, friendships, networking, image building, to reach heights no one expected. Isn't that what ambition looks like in the modern world? Isn't that admirable? But to her critics, it wasn't resilience. It was manipulation, a cold climb disguised as charm. And Thomas, standing firmly among those critics, insists the friendship with Jessica was the clearest sign of that climb. But here's where the suspense sharpens. Because Thomas doesn't just accuse Meghan of social climbing. He claims Meghan already had her eyes on Harry before she even met him. That Jessica wasn't just a friend, but a bridge. That Meghan positioned herself close to the Mulroneys because she knew their network stretched all the way to the royal family. If that's true, then Meghan's first encounter with Harry wasn't fate. It was the result of positioning, of ambition, of targeting. And think about the irony. Meghan has told the world she didn't know much about Harry before meeting him. She downplayed her knowledge, presented herself as someone who had no clue what she was stepping into. But if Thomas's account is right, she wasn't blind. She was focused. She wasn't surprised. She was ready. And the friendship with Jessica was the door through which her royal dream finally became attainable. So now we arrive at the most critical question. Was Harry a man Meghan fell in love with, or was he a target? Was their romance a spontaneous spark, or the result of years of positioning and networking that funneled Meghan directly into his orbit? Because if Thomas's claims are true, Meghan's fairy tale wasn't fate at all. It was design. And that design becomes most visible when you look at her relationship with Harry himself. How it started, how it unfolded, how it was presented to the world as destiny, when Thomas insists it was anything but. What if the great royal romance wasn't a chance encounter at all? What if Prince Harry, one of the most eligible bachelors on the planet, wasn't the man Meghan fell head over heels for by fate, but the very target she'd been moving toward all along? That's the allegation Thomas Markle keeps circling back to. And it's the one that cuts deepest. Because if Meghan had her eyes on Harry before she even met him, then their love story, the one sold to the world as spontaneous and pure, suddenly looks like a strategy executed to perfection. Let's start with Meghan's own words. She has always insisted she didn't know much about Harry before their first date. In interviews, she portrayed herself as almost oblivious to the royal family's inner workings. She claimed she didn't Google him. She insisted that she entered their meeting with innocence, curiosity, and an open heart. That narrative was central to the fairy tale. Meghan as the outsider who stumbled into love without preconceived notions. But here's the problem. Thomas, and even some of Meghan's old friends, tell a different story. They claim Meghan knew exactly who Harry was, that she spoke of him before their meeting, that she had always been fascinated by British royalty, and Harry was the crown jewel of that fascination. Think about the timing. Meghan was newly single after ending her relationship with Toronto chef Corey Vitiello. She was already mingling in circles close to the royals, thanks to Jessica Mulroney and others. Suddenly, she's in London, attending parties, inserting herself into spaces where introductions to people like Harry weren't just possible, they were probable. Was that coincidence? Or was it positioning? Ask yourself. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to just happen to meet the right person at the right time? The romantic explanation is fate. The cynical explanation is strategy. Which one do you believe fits Meghan? Here's where it gets even more suspicious. Meghan has described her first blind date with Harry as arranged by a mutual friend. But who was that friend? Some say it was Violet von Wessenholz, a PR executive with deep ties to the aristocracy. Others point to Marcus Anderson, Meghan's Soho House connection. Either way, both were part of elite networks Meghan had deliberately woven herself into. Doesn't that suggest the meeting wasn't random at all, but a carefully engineered introduction? And let's not forget Harry himself. By the time Meghan met him, Harry was wounded, reeling from years of scandal, struggling with grief, and increasingly desperate to redefine his image. To him, Meghan was refreshing. Glamorous but not aristocratic, independent but adoring, worldly yet seemingly untouched by royal obsession. She was everything he thought he needed. But if Thomas is right, Meghan knew that. She understood his vulnerabilities, his desire to break free, his attraction to someone different, and she leaned into it. If true, that means Harry didn't just fall in love. He was pulled into a story Meghan had been rehearsing for years. Now, let's layer in the contradictions. Meghan claims she never thought much about the royals. Yet her alleged diaries, emails, and conversations, the ones Thomas points to, all suggest fascination with royalty long before Harry. She claimed naivety about curtsies, protocols, and the royal world. Yet if she had researched and dreamed of marrying a prince, she knew far more than she let on. Doesn't that unravel the innocence she's built her brand on? And the irony here is almost cruel. Meghan once wrote about being a young girl, looking at Princess Diana's funeral with tears in her eyes. She said Diana inspired her. That alone shows awareness of the royals. But when you connect that with Thomas's allegations, that Meghan always wanted to be part of that world, Diana doesn't just become a tragic figure Meghan admired. Diana becomes a role Meghan coveted. The emotional stakes couldn't be higher. If Meghan truly targeted Harry, then what does that make him? A man in love, or a pawn in a grander scheme? Imagine being Harry, realizing the woman who claimed she never Googled you may have been writing about men like you years before. That realization would devastate him. It would shake the foundation of their marriage. And yet, his silence speaks volumes. Either he doesn't believe it, or he can't admit it. And the palace? They've always been suspicious of outsiders. To them, Meghan's ambition looked dangerous. If they suspected she had targeted Harry, then their resistance to her wasn't just racism or tradition, it was fear. Fear that she wasn't there by accident, but by design. Fear that the monarchy itself had been infiltrated by someone who knew exactly how to play the game. So here we are, left with the question no one wants to answer. Was Harry truly the love of Meghan's life? Or was he the final box ticked in a plan years in the making? Because if Thomas's claims are right, Meghan didn't stumble into royalty. She hunted it. And Harry, the most vulnerable prince of his generation, was her prize. But the emails Thomas claims to hold don't just hint at fascination. They suggest timing, strategy, and intent. And when you combine them with Meghan's actions leading up to her first date with Harry, the picture gets darker. Because those emails, Thomas insists, were written before Harry ever entered the scene. And they may just prove that Harry wasn't destiny. He was a target. Picture a set of old emails tucked away in the depths of a forgotten inbox. To most, they'd look ordinary. Digital chatter, nothing more than late-night ramblings or back-and-forth notes with friends. But to Thomas Markle, these emails are dynamite. Why? Because he claims they were written before Meghan even knew Prince Harry. And yet, they read like the blueprint of a woman aiming directly for the royal circle. Now, let's be clear. The exact content of these emails hasn't been laid out for the world to see. But Thomas has dropped enough hints to paint a chilling picture. He says Meghan wrote about big dreams, about wanting to rise beyond Hollywood, about craving a life where influence mattered more than credits on a TV show. That alone isn't unusual. Countless ambitious women have written similar things. But here's the sting. Thomas insists that Meghan's words weren't vague, that she specifically mentioned the appeal of British royalty. Not fame in general, not Hollywood stardom. Royalty. Can you feel the contradiction? Meghan has spent years insisting she never Googled Harry, never studied the monarchy, never knew what she was getting into. She portrayed herself as a wide-eyed outsider, blindsided by the intensity of royal life. But if Thomas is telling the truth, those emails expose something very different. A woman who was already thinking about it, already writing about it, already envisioning herself in that life. Doesn't that change the entire fairy tale? Now ask yourself, have you ever sent an email you'd be horrified for the world to read later? Of course, we all have. Words typed in the heat of the moment can look incriminating years later. Maybe Meghan was just venting, just dreaming out loud. But if these emails included lines like, "I could see myself with someone royal," or "Hollywood is too small for me," then they stop looking like harmless dreams. They start looking like intent. And think of the timing. Meghan was still grinding on Suits. She had a lifestyle blog. She was hustling, branding, building, but she wasn't breaking into global fame. To her, Hollywood was limited. But the royal family? That was endless. Centuries of history. Worldwide attention. The closest thing the modern world has to myth. What if Meghan realized that long before she ever sat across from Harry on that first date? Here's where it gets darker. Thomas suggests Meghan wasn't just typing these thoughts for herself. She was sharing them with others. Friends. Confidants. That matters, because it means she wasn't ashamed of her ambition. She was speaking it into existence. And those friends, if they've kept those emails or those memories, hold the keys to proving Thomas right. Imagine the scandal if one of those old contacts leaked a message, Meghan's own words contradicting her polished interviews. Now, let's flip perspectives. To Meghan's defenders, these emails prove nothing sinister. They'd say she was manifesting, dreaming big, doing exactly what every life coach encourages people to do. Envision the future you want. Doesn't that sound empowering? But to her critics, these same emails are evidence of manipulation. Proof she set her sights on Harry long before she met him. Same words, two very different interpretations. Which side would you fall on? And what about Harry? If he's ever seen these emails, how would that feel? Imagine discovering that the woman you thought never Googled you once wrote about the very world you belong to. Would you feel betrayed? Embarrassed? Or would you brush it off as harmless ambition? That question lingers in the silence, because Harry has never spoken about it. And that silence might be the loudest clue of all. But Thomas won't let it rest. He hints that these emails aren't the only writings. That Meghan didn't just stop with typed words. She put pen to paper too. Diaries. Private reflections. Notes to herself that, if revealed, would strip away any remaining innocence in her story. And while emails can be dismissed as jokes or taken out of context, handwritten diaries cut deeper. They feel raw, honest, undeniable, which raises the terrifying possibility. If the emails already hint at ambition, what do the diaries contain? Thomas says those pages go even further, that they don't just suggest Meghan dreamed of royalty. They suggest she was actively planning for it. And if that's true, then the love story we all watched wasn't just improbable romance. It was execution of a plan written years before. Think back to that first meeting. The story we've all been told is romantic, almost cinematic. A blind date, a spark, and a whirlwind romance that swept Meghan Markle and Prince Harry from strangers to newlyweds in what felt like the blink of an eye. But what if that night wasn't the beginning of a love story at all? What if it was the culmination of years of positioning, planning, and ambition? What if the so-called coincidental first encounter was, as Thomas Markle suggests, anything but coincidence? Let's rewind to the months leading up to it. Meghan was freshly out of her long-term relationship with Toronto chef Corey Vitiello. Her blog, The Tig, had been shut down. Suits was steady, but not skyrocketing. She was restless, searching. And just as those doors closed, others began to open. Through Jessica Mulroney, through Soho House connections like Marcus Anderson, through Toronto's elite circles that brushed against British aristocracy, Meghan suddenly found herself in the exact spaces where someone like Harry could be reached. Doesn't that feel more like alignment than accident? Here's the irony that Thomas loves to point out. Meghan insists she didn't know much about Harry before they met. She's repeated that line so often it's practically a mantra. But let's be honest, who on earth in Meghan's position wouldn't know who Prince Harry was? One of the most photographed men on the planet. Son of Diana. The party prince whose escapades filled tabloids across the globe. For Meghan to say she was oblivious strains credibility. And when you place that claim next to Thomas's allegations of old diaries and emails mentioning royalty, the innocence collapses. Now imagine the night itself. A dinner arranged by a mutual friend. Some say Violet von Wessenholz, others Marcus Anderson. Meghan walks in, perfectly poised, radiant, charming. Harry, vulnerable and weary of being seen as the spare, sees her as fresh air. Their chemistry is undeniable. But here's the chilling question. Was Meghan walking in blind, or was she walking in ready? Had she already rehearsed this moment in her mind, maybe even in her writings, long before fate delivered it? Ask yourself, how many of us have been on first dates where the other person already knew more about us than they admitted? Social media, friends, gossip, it happens every day. But in Meghan's case, the stakes were enormous. If she truly knew who Harry was, if she had already envisioned a life with someone like him, then that first date wasn't innocent curiosity. It was execution. And Harry? Poor Harry. He has admitted publicly that he was smitten almost instantly. He texted her eagerly, pursued her quickly, and within months, they were flying between continents to see each other. To him, it was love at first sight. But if Thomas's version holds any truth, Harry wasn't swept into love. He was ensnared in a plan Meghan had been rehearsing long before. The palace, too, was wary. Behind closed doors, royal courtiers are said to have questioned Meghan's speed, her background, her intentions. To them, it felt fast. Too fast. They wondered if she was in it for the right reasons. That suspicion didn't vanish. It grew louder as Harry grew more protective. And now, with Thomas claiming Meghan's diaries and conversations prove she had long targeted royalty, the palace's instincts look less like prejudice and more like prescience. But let's not forget the emotional side of this. If Meghan did plan her royal encounter, is that really so shocking? Haven't countless women and men dreamed of marrying up, of seizing opportunity, of climbing into a world larger than themselves? Some call it ambition. Others call it manipulation. Meghan's story forces us to confront where the line is drawn. Is a woman wrong for envisioning her future and chasing it? Or does it become sinister when that future involves one of the world's most protected families? Here's where the tension sharpens into a blade. Thomas insists that even that first date wasn't happenstance. That Meghan deliberately placed herself in Harry's orbit, through friends who could deliver the introduction she wanted. If that's true, then the fairy tale opening scene wasn't fate. It was Act 1 of a play Meghan had written years earlier. And that leads to a devastating cliffhanger. Because if Meghan's very first meeting with Harry was the result of targeting, not chance, then what does that say about everything that came after? The engagement, the wedding, the exit, the Netflix deals. Were they chapters in a love story or acts in a performance designed for the ultimate spotlight? And according to Thomas, the performance didn't end with that first date. In fact, Hollywood itself would soon collide with royalty, and the actress who always wanted a bigger stage would finally step onto the grandest one of all. Hollywood loves a good performance. But what happens when the stage lights dim and the actress steps into a role far bigger than any casting director could ever offer? That's exactly the question Thomas Markle throws at the world when he talks about Meghan's transition from Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex. To him, it wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It was a career move, the role of a lifetime, carefully sought, perfectly executed, and endlessly performed. Let's set the scene. Before Harry, Meghan's career had plateaued. Suits gave her steady work, but it didn't make her a superstar. She wasn't landing movie roles. She wasn't headlining Hollywood blockbusters. In the brutal language of Hollywood, she was a working actress, not an icon. So what does someone in that position do? They look for a bigger stage. And according to Thomas, Meghan found hers in royalty. Think about the parallels. Hollywood and Buckingham Palace may seem worlds apart, but at their core, both are about performance, image, and control. Stars in Hollywood live for the camera. Royals live under it. Meghan, trained in the art of acting, understood exactly how to hold herself, how to deliver lines, how to project poise. When she stepped into royal life, she wasn't a novice. She was seasoned, and that's what made her so dangerous to the palace. She didn't just marry Harry. She played the role of Duchess with the skill of an actress who had been preparing her whole life. Now, here's where the contradictions sting. Meghan has repeatedly said she was blindsided by the expectations of royal life. She claims she didn't understand the rules, the protocols, the restrictions. But if Thomas is right, if her diaries and emails really did reveal fascination with royalty years earlier, then her naivety collapses. It wasn't shock. It wasn't ignorance. It was performance. And every curtsy, every hand wave, every demure smile at the wedding suddenly looks less like learning on the spot and more like rehearsed execution. Ask yourself, have you ever seen Meghan on camera? Her Oprah interview, her Netflix documentary, her speeches. She never stumbles, never loses her composure, never appears untrained. That isn't coincidence. That's experience. That's acting. And Thomas argues that Meghan brought Hollywood straight into Buckingham Palace, not as a guest, but as a weapon. But here's the irony. Meghan herself once wrote on her blog about how little girls dream of being princesses. She mocked it, saying she preferred to dream of being a strong, independent woman instead. And yet, if Thomas's allegations are true, she was dreaming of royalty all along. Doesn't that contradiction slice right through the carefully built image she presents to the world? And what about Harry? Poor Harry, who grew up watching his mother's torment at the hands of the press. To him, Meghan's confidence with cameras must have seemed like salvation. Here was a woman who didn't shrink under the spotlight, who didn't tremble at flashbulbs, who didn't resent the attention. She thrived on it. But was that because she was strong? Or because she had always wanted that spotlight, and now she finally had it? This is where the emotional tension deepens. Because if Meghan knew what she was doing, then Harry wasn't just in love. He was outmatched. A man who hated the media, paired with a woman who understood it better than anyone. A man desperate for authenticity, paired with a woman trained in performance. Doesn't that look less like compatibility and more like imbalance? And let's not forget the palace. Imagine their horror as Meghan dazzled the cameras from day one. She wasn't a shy duchess. She wasn't awkward or unprepared. She was magnetic. Headlines called her a breath of fresh air. The public adored her. To royal traditionalists, this wasn't a blessing. It was a threat, because a woman who knew how to perform that well, that quickly, wasn't just fitting in. She was taking over. Now, here's where Thomas's claims hit hardest. He insists Meghan's Hollywood years weren't a detour. They were training. Every photo shoot, every interview, every blog post. Training. And when the time came, Meghan didn't just walk into royal life. She starred in it. The palace thought they were gaining a duchess. But what they really gained, Thomas says, was an actress in the role of her life. And that raises the chilling cliffhanger. What happens when the role you've been rehearsing for years collides with an institution built on centuries of tradition? Something has to give. And Thomas swears that when the palace finally realized Meghan's ambitions weren't just about love, but about influence, they panicked.